All right. I want to welcome whoever is going to watch this to my second lecture and presentation. I will continue with the themes I got myself into last time. One theme was, how did psychology come to be? How did it come to be a learned discipline in universities? How did it come to be a career that people join? Because this overlapped with my life. How did I come to be interested in becoming a psychologist? I couldn't have become a psychologist if there was no psychology. So both of these parallel tracks are what I want to go on exploring. In time, I have come into the 1930s because that's when I was born. I was born in 1931. And psychology came into the 1930s then as a discipline. It made a long journey out of philosophy towards psychology and then into a psychology that was concerned with applying things that were being learned to human dilemmas. That was whole dynamic over many years. I left this enterprise in a cliffhanger last week. I described how I had actually arrived on Earth as a restitution child. My mother had had an abortion because she really didn't want a third child, and then felt so guilty and was counseled by a psychiatrist that she needed to make restitution to my father and to the child she had killed. So I became the restitution child. And when I was born, 7 years after my middle sister, 3 years after the abortion, she actually went into a horrible, what we would call a postpartum depression now. And that's where I left you. So let me comment on her postpartum depression because it's had profound effects on what I struggle with, what I became, and what kinds of wounds I'm still carrying this many years later. She mainly took to bed. She hardly ever got out of bed. She frequently had a cold cloth on her head if I went to visit her in her bedroom because there were a lot of bodily reactions to her misery, too. She had chronic migraine headaches frequently, several times a week. She also had bad eczema over many parts of her body. So she was usually with the blinds drawn so the light wouldn't bother her migraines. It was dark in her room even during the day. She had many bandages on various parts of her body covering her weeping eczema wounds. And it was apparent that she was just miserable. Once in a while, she would come out in an old tattered nightgown. She barely got dressed many days of the week. My father, in desperation, hired a teenage nanny for me. We lived in Pittsburgh, the city of the steel mills. From one of the suburbs, he got a Polish mill worker's 17-year-old daughter to come and live with us, and she became my surrogate mother. Her name was Anna Harizo. I will enshrine her in memory. In some ways, I of me, an infant, and she had to do everything in the household. She had to keep it clean. She had to walk to the neighborhood market, bring home the food. She had to cook. She had to do the laundry. And by then, it was hand wringers to wring the clothing and vats of starch to starch my father's good shirt. She had to do the ironing, the laundry, everything. She was responsible for everything, including taking care of me. And yet, in spite of that, I could tell that when she had free time, she valued playing with me. She would smile at me. She would pick me up and throw me up in the air and catch me. And I knew she loved me. Thank God. I think that connection to her saved me from being terribly wounded in ways even worse than the wounds I was getting. The worst memory I have of my interactions with my mother during this period when she was so incapacitated was nearing the end of her third year of her retreat into her bedroom. I somehow inherited the idea that it was up to me to cheer her up. I had some responsibility to make her smile if I possibly could. So I remember coming in with some toy I wanted to show her. And as a toddler between 2 and 3, closer to 3, I said, "Good morning, Mom." And I said, "Look at my toy. Could we read a book together?" And she said, I don't want to look at your toy or look at what you're bringing me. She said, look at how my eczema is still bothering me. She said, you see all of it? You see how miserable I am? It's because you were born, she said to me. And that was like a knife in my heart. And I think in some ways the knife is still in my heart. From that moment forward, I have been driven. I had to prove that she was wrong, that it was not a bad thing that I had gotten born, that the world will be a better place because I had gotten born, that my life has value. I had to be the best student. I had to make a difference. I was driven. I'm still driven. Never, no accomplishment is enough. No award is enough. There needs to be more. I'm still not convinced that I should be alive. I'm still not convinced that it was a good thing that I've gotten born. Her words sit in me, simmering with a terrible power. Much of what I've done with my life has been an attempt to overcome that. That's certainly something that's oriented me towards being interested in psychology. Alan Wheelis, whose works I love, wrote a paper called The Vocational Hazards of Psychoanalysis. He was a training analyst at the San Francisco Institute in the 60s and 70s. In his paper, he tries to find out what those of us who are drawn to the helping professions may have in common. And he came to the conclusion that for most of us, there was some unfathomable family trauma or traumas that were going on that affected us profoundly, that we didn't understand, and that we went into the field to try to search for answers. Why did that happen? And what can be done about it? And is it reversible? So in the attempt to go to school to get more education, and in the attempt to get our clients to heal, we are still trying to get us to overcome the disappointments, the hurts, and even the traumas that happened to us while we were growing up. We are particularly prone to want to go into one of the helping professions if we've had that kind of background. So my own wounds certainly predisposed me, even though I didn't think about it while I was growing up. I'm going to figure out how I got wounded, what it did to me, and how to reverse it. That was not on my mind when I was picking careers early on in elementary school and high school, and as I was moving towards college. But I think it certainly predisposed me to be vulnerable to wanting to go into psychology. I also know that the dysfunction in my family was very widespread. I had two sisters. Each of my sisters married. There were two husbands, and each of them had a daughter. So there were 6 people in that cohort, just ahead of me on the trail. 5 of the 6 of them spent significant amounts of time in mental hospitals, starting when I was heading into adolescence and on across the years of my life ahead of that. So they too were very, very damaged by a variety of other things, not just by mother's depression. Terribly depressed and damaged. 2 of them, my oldest sister and her daughter, both committed suicide much later in life. They could never escape the darkness and the shadow that fell on us. But I was not interested in psychology. I didn't know anything about psychology. I did know that my mother had gone to the alienist, but I didn't find that out till I was 50. I didn't know that my sister and my brother-in-law were going to go to psychoanalysts later on. My sister, her and her husband were going to psychoanalysts later on. I was already in graduate school by the time that happened. And so I grew up wanting only 2 things. I was a formidably bright student. I always had my hand up starting in kindergarten and on through elementary school. If the teacher was asking a question, I knew the answer and I resented it. She didn't call on me because I wanted to show off. I wanted to show everybody how bright I was, how valuable I was. I wanted affirmation. I wanted to be appreciated. And I tried as much as I can to suck it out of people by being bright, smart, creative, and clever. Didn't get me very far with my parents. They never looked at my report card. They assumed I was doing okay. They would just sign it with a glance. They never came to any play I was in. I was in some plays in elementary school. They never came to an open house. They didn't join the PTA. And I learned to play the clarinet when I was in later elementary school and on in junior high. And there were performances occasionally, and they never came to see me perform. They were busy with other things, and they didn't have room or time for their son. Somehow Anna was supposed to raise me, and the rest of it I was supposed to do by myself. I did very well. I only got one B in all of elementary school, junior high, and high school. And my favorite topics were in the sciences. I loved physics. I excelled at physics. I loved chemistry, and I excelled at chemistry. I'm sorry I never had a chance to take an astronomy course. I didn't take geology either. There were a bunch of sciences I wanted to take when I got to UCLA, but I was already bent to do other things. But I was in a kind of bind as I got into my junior year in college. I knew I was probably going to UCLA because we had moved to Southern California after my father's death because expensive and were quite highly rated. I had picked UCLA because several of the people I'd become the most friendly with were going to UCLA too. So I knew the destination, but I had the foggiest notion what I was going to study. And I felt torn. I had excelled so much in physics, and my physics teacher was like a surrogate father for me. I had loved him and loved his praise and his appreciation of me. And nuclear physics was such a hot topic in those few years right after the end of World War II because of the building of the atomic bomb and the power it held over the future of the whole human race. I wanted to get into studying nuclear physics and be part of what was going to unfold in the years ahead. It seemed like nuclear energy offered the power of taking care of the Earth's power needs. So I wanted to know how that was going to happen and how could I contribute perhaps to taming nuclear power and making it a source of power to light our houses and to make other things happen in the peaceful sphere. It was not going to be just a weapon. On the other hand, I loved writing. Uh, I wrote short stories for my own entertainment. I did a lot of creative writing. Every time I took a course where I had to do some writing, my teachers very much appreciated that I was a good writer and wanted to encourage me. So I thought maybe I should major in literature or in creative writing. And that was a terrible tear. Those two things are very far apart. They're entirely different kinds of careers, but I could feel that they represent very important parts of mine, and I couldn't make a decision about which to do. My sister, my middle sister, came up with a solution. She had moved out by then by the time I was a junior in high school, and she was visiting. And I told her my dilemma. I said, you've always wanted to be a writer. You've majored in literature, and now you're a literature teacher. You don't do much writing anymore, but you thought you'd be a novelist. Well, that's the same dream I seem to have some of the time, but yet I'm very committed to becoming a physicist. What do you think I should do? She said, I can't decide for you what you should do, but I saw something in the newspaper that might help you. I said, what's that? She said, well, the VA hospital at Brentwood on Wilshire Boulevard put a big ad in the LA Times. They're not seeing so many soldiers from World War II anymore. That whole processing that they did has been turning downwards. The US government was very, very wise and very kind as World War II began to tail away. They were wise because they didn't want to repeat the mistakes they had made in other wars. Simply bringing all the troops home, taking them to a relocation center where they would turn in their uniforms and they would get their tickets home and then just sending them back out into society. The government recognized that having been away for many years for some of them was a particularly traumatic thing they had lived through, that they were going to have problems with adjustment, and the government took responsibility for trying to oversee their return to civilian life and staying with them in civilian life until they were comfortable again. So it set up programs of family counseling, vocational counseling. Uh, for the psychiatric wounded, there were programs of therapy and inpatient treatment, and they were going to try and make the veterans as whole as they could before they let go of them and stop their VA services. So I was now in the second year of high school. I was in 1947. It was 2 years after the end of the war. And we had 30 million adult Americans in military service. 30 million in a population that was not much more than a million. It would be like having 90 million people in the Army right now with our current population, where there was total mobilization for war while that was going on. So there was a great tide of people that had to be returned. Many of them lost their jobs. Many of their marriages had broken up. Many of them were strangers. Their wife had been pregnant. They never saw their child for several years. And it was just a very stressful time, and God bless the U.S. government for wanting to do the best it could to take care of that. But it was now facing with starting to close down outpatient centers and starting to close down VA hospitals and letting a lot of VA personnel go because they wouldn't be needed anymore. So in order to buffer the shock of having to do that, they did a strange thing. They opened the VAs to civilians for 2 years. Civilians could go and pay a small fee out of pocket and get the same services that they were used to providing to returning veterans. You could get vocational counseling, you could get family counseling, you could get psychiatric services, all of them for very little money or free in the VA. So my sister said, why don't you go and have some vocational counseling? I said, what's vocational counseling? She said, somebody will give you some tests and talk to you and find out about your interest and interview you about this dilemma you're feeling. And based on your aptitudes and your talents, all these will be assessed. That worker will make some recommendations to you about what you can do with yourself. And it might be very meaningful. And I looked at the fee. It will cost you $100 to have that service. That's what they're charging for that. And my mother willingly agreed to pay the $100. So off I went one day during spring break to get vocational counseling from the Veterans Administration. And I was ushered into the presence of James Bugenthal. He was a recent graduate from the program at Ohio State University, and his first job out of graduate school had been his post in the VA in the counseling psychology department in the VA. And he had been in the VA for 4 years now. And he was a very pleasant man. He welcomed me very warmly. I could tell he was interested in working with me, and he was taking on a challenge he hadn't been used to. He was going to have a late adolescent kid rather than somebody returning from military service, but he was up for the challenge. So he interviewed me for about an hour about what I like doing in my spare time, the dilemma that I experienced as I experienced it, uh, what things that I like reading, what hobbies that I have other than the things I mentioned, the activities of my spare time. What did I imagine myself doing 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Where was I planning on going to school? And after talking to me for an hour in a very kind and appreciative fashion, he said, all right, I've made a decision. I have several vocational interest inventories to administer to you, and I have some aptitude tests to administer to you, and I want to give you an intelligence test, and I have maybe 15 to 20 hours worth of testing I'm going to do, so you'll have to continue to come back. I'll be with you for some of the tests. Other people, some clerks will administer some of the others, but after you're finished with all the testing, you and I will then meet, and I'll go over the test results with you, and I'll see if I have any intelligent suggestions to make to you about what you might do as the next stage of preparation for your life to come. So I thanked him, and I was very eager to get started. And I took the strong interest inventory. There was another one I took. I don't remember what the name of it was. I took the Wechsler Bellevue intelligence test. I took practical test of skills. I took a damn tweezer dexterity test where I had a big tweezer in my hand. I had to pick up 3 little pegs at a time and set them into a hole with my tweezer and get them right, and then go on and fill the next hole. How many holes could I fill in the time that was allotted me to fill holes with the tweezer? I had to do it first with my left hand and then with my right hand. I had a spatial relations test I had to take, orienting myself in space and answering questions about how this figure would look if you looked at the bottom of it rather than the top of it, and what would it look like. I can still remember many of the tests, and I was eager for it. I enjoyed going through it. I felt like I was doing very well on most of the things that were given to me. And I waited with eager anticipation to have the feedback about what conclusions he had come to. So I met with him. He said, your intelligence is somewhere between the 98th and 99th percentile. You are very, very bright, he said to me. You could probably do anything you chose to do. You probably would not have trouble. And yes, you do have good writing skills, and yes, you show great talent and aptitude for studying one of the sciences. But here I said, ever considered becoming a psychologist? He said to me. I said, no, I had never considered becoming a psychologist. Why would I consider becoming a psychologist? I don't want to work with, am I going to work with crazy people? That doesn't seem to have any interest in me. He said, no, no, no. Psychology is a scholarly discipline. Only a few psychologists work with crazy people. It's a very broad discipline that you might like because it would most likely involve, it's both a science and an art. It would most likely involve you having to study lots of things that are quite scientific in their texture and the kinds of research studies that are done to proceed with knowing more about them. And you'd get a chance to do a lot of writing. It would make use of both halves of you. It's the one career I can think of that's likely to pull at you on both sides of what you struggle with. So I'd like you to suggest it. I said, well, I'm going to UCLA next fall. What would you suggest I enroll in? He said, why don't you just start with the 2 things that were important to you? Why don't you declare a joint major? Declare a physics major and declare a literature major, and take the introductory courses that are offered for people who are coming into both of those majors. But you will have room for at least one elective, even if you start in that way. And consider taking introductory psychology. Why don't you learn more about what the field is all about and what psychologists do? Because they do an amazing variety of things, and we're even discovering more and more things that psychologists are interested in doing as the discipline continues to age and mature. So I was ready. I had my plan. He had done a great service for me. I'd enjoyed knowing him and working with him. So there I go. Off I went to UCLA, and I was signed up. I managed to get the introductory physics course for physics majors. I had managed to take the creative writing course, the introduction to creative writing for literature majors. I forgot. Oh, as part of the physics major, I had to take analytic geometry. That was required of physics majors too. So I'd signed up for a math course, and then I had room for one more. I took I did take the introduction to psychology course. I had friends who had been at UCLA for a year already. So as I was going over and trying to enroll in various things, I asked them if they knew the professors. They didn't know any of the psychology professors. They were no help. But I decided that I was going to take psychology. There was a section offered at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I decided to go to UCLA at 8 o'clock in the morning my first semester because parking was very limited. I had a student parking pass, but the parking lots would get filled up because most of my age cohort liked sleeping in the morning and not having to start school too early. So I didn't mind getting up early. I was going to beat the racket by showing up for 8 o'clock class. But the 8 o'clock class didn't say who was teaching it. It said, to be arranged, the woeful TBA. So no professor had been assigned to it yet, so I'll take a chance. That was the first class. It was Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. And my first day on campus on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, I walk into a big lecture hall with slanted seats around it. It held maybe 200 people. And I sat down, and then from the side door, in came James F.T. Bugenthal, the man who had done the vocational counseling. He had been laid off in the months after I had had vocational counseling with him, and he had secured a lectureship from UCLA. He was now a lecturer at UCLA, and he had picked up the class that nobody was teaching, and they had assigned to him the teaching of the introductory psychology class. So he smiled when he saw me in the audience. I made a point, I'm going to go up and thank him again. I'm here. I'll talk to him after class. And he started lecturing, and he was rivetingly interesting. He made the things he was talking about sing. He later went on to be such an important person in the existential humanistic movement in our field, wrote many textbooks, was a wonderful therapist, gave many workshops of many kinds. It was an honor to know him. I didn't know what an honor it was at the time he was teaching me introductory psychology. But I did go up and talk to him. He remembered me, of course, right away. He said he was glad I was here. And I said, well, I know what to do this semester. What shall I do next semester? And again, he started coaching me. Well, I didn't like my introductory physics class that much. And I was laboring with the math I had to learn. And I was fascinated with psychology. Writing came good. I got a good grade in the writing class, but I did begin to feel like he may have been right about becoming a psychologist. So I was a February student who had graduated in February and started college in February. I had summer session coming. He had also counseled me, take as many electives as you can. If you can go to school and can afford not to work and go to school in the summertime, take summer classes too. Take as many classes as you want. I said, well, what kind of classes should I take if I'm interested in becoming a psychologist? He says, take literature classes, take mythology classes, take anthropology classes, and take philosophy classes. You will learn more about the people and who people are and what people struggle with taking those electives than you will in most of the psychology classes we teach around here. And so I thanked him and I followed his lead. I took an elective with him in the summer. It was called Problems of Adjustment, he taught in summer session. And it was, again, delicious. I learned about working with people who were not crazy, but who were struggling because they were limited in some way or another. And it was delicious to take the class. By the end of summer session, I dropped my previous few majors and I elected to become a psychologist. So let me pause there for a moment and say what was happening in psychology as I was getting ready to join up with psychology. In the 30s, when I was born, the Rorschach test had been exported to the United States, and it had captured great interest. Psychiatrists were beginning to depend upon psychologists who knew the Rorschach test to do testing with people that they were uncertain about how to formulate a reasonable treatment plan. It was as if the projective tests that were coming online, plus things like the MMPI, could allow the psychologist to take what the psychiatrists were calling an X-ray of the psyche and see deeper into the psyche than they could with some psychiatric interviews for a while. And that we should be the handmaiden of psychiatry and help them design their treatment plans, because we could see things with the use of our tests that they could not see until they had known somebody for a year or two sometimes. More things would become apparent to them. So we were X-ray technicians. And by the 1930s, something like 200 people around the country had left the university campuses and were no longer teaching psychology anymore, but were doing this task. They were in independent practice, providing testing services to the psychiatric profession and earning their living from fees that the clients were paying them for testing them. Uh, Projective testing had blossomed during the 1930s. Henry Murray had first designed the children's the apperception, the TAT, and the thematic apperception test, and then work started on the children's apperception test too. Projective testing was a way of seeing into how people organize their thoughts because you gave them something that was ambiguous, and through the reactions they gave to the ambiguity, you could learn about their perceptual style, the kinds of themes that occurred to them, and there was great excitement in both the field of psychiatry and in the field of psychology about these developments. World War II did also make a boom for what psychologists were doing. Lots of psychologists were called into government service. Psychologists were with all kinds of interests and professors of all kinds of content. Kurt Lewin, who was probably the world's expert on how people are influenced and by what means people are influenced, all his studies and published works as a social psychologist up to then were on the theme of influence. And he had fled Hitler in the middle of 1930s because he was Jewish and was hired at the University of Iowa, where he continued his studies on influence. The US government asked him if he would come to Washington. We need you to influence the civilian population. Well, what were the tasks he needed to influence the civilian population about? Well, things were going to be rationed. Meat was going to be rationed. Sugar was going to be rationed. Gasoline was going to be rationed. Driving was going to be rationed. Travel was going to be rationed. He needed to convince the public that these sacrifices were important. The leadership that isn't happening right now, to convince the public that these sacrifices were important. And the future of the war effort really depended on people being willing to put up with some kinds of deprivation and pain in order to help the war effort go forward. Oh, growing victory gardens, raising some of your own food in your own backyard. If you had a lawn, ripping up the lawn and planting vegetables instead of a lawn back there and tending to it. So he had public affairs campaigns, playing in the motion picture theaters and playing on the radio with one or another of these themes about the importance of these sacrifices. The one thing he couldn't do, he did not succeed at, was the government asked him, since we were wasting many things, to get Americans to eat cuts of meat that they don't ordinarily eat, like brains or hearts or lungs or what do the French consider kidneys, other things that are considered delicacies in some cultures, but Americans won't go close to. He failed at that task. His ads and his public service announcements didn't help. But at last, he came up with the idea of creating something called Spam, mixing a little ham in it, taking all the cuts of meat that were being wasted, grinding it up, making a loaf out of it, putting it in a can, and being able to fry it in a frying pan or eat it in a sandwich or so on. And Spam turned out to be a very successful food. It's still being, the Hawaiian Japanese love Spam for some reason I can't understand. They consume a lot of it in Hawaii. It's the Gelson still sells Spam. That was successful. The other influence attempts weren't successful at all. We had psychologists designing aptitude tests to pick people to fly bombers and to be bombardiers in bombers. One of my professors at the University of Michigan, Elo Kelly, was hired by what was the OSS, it's now the CIA. His job was to come up with selection methods for choosing good spies. What are the attributes of a good spy? How do you pick out of all the people who have been drafted and come into the military, people who should be shunted aside, not sent into combat, but trained to be spies, develop the criteria they should meet, and then develop how do we train spies? What constitutes effective training of people who are going to be spies? That's what he worked on for 4 years during World War II. And he was still not allowed when I went to graduate school some years later to talk about what he did. He couldn't tell us what the criteria were for choosing spies. I do know that he developed all kinds of stress circumstances he would put them in. It was miserable becoming a spy. He really made them suffer and to make sure that they would not squeal or demand to be let out or anything, that they could tolerate pain and suffering and deprivation very well. That much I know. But that was the psychologist deciding something for the war effort. Those are the main examples of what I can think of. But as I said, the government not only created new kinds of psychological services and found new uses for psychology, but it decided, because it had seen what had happened with psychiatric need during World War II, that it needed to do something ongoing about psychiatric need in the United States. Most of the psychiatrists who are working in private sanitarium and in public hospitals who were working with the damaged population got drafted because the government knew there were going to be a horrible number of psychiatric casualties as a huge war unfolded. And it wanted to give them the best service possible. But it had to worry about who was going to stand in to man these posts that were being vacated by the people who were being drafted. And it gave nurses the best training it could, and being more responsible than they had been used to being. And it decided there needed to be a paraprofessional cadre. There needed to be something like psychiatric assistants to try and stretch the number of psychiatrists that existed. And a cousin of mine, after having been drafted and reporting for duty, was asked, did he have any psychology courses? He had had an introductory psychology course as an undergraduate before he'd gone into military service. He was shunted off to be a psychiatric aide. Anybody who had had any exposure to anything psychological as they went into the military became psychiatric aides. They either worked at hospitals back here in the United States, or they were even staffing frontline hospitals where the people who were just cracking under the strain were being shunted to the hospital just behind where the front line was at that time. To get, a lot of them were given sodium pentothal interviews. They were put in a trance with sodium pentothal and asked to recount the trauma they had just gone through and to relive the trauma. That was one of the first aid things that were being done. And the psychology cadre was not giving injections, but they were the one conducting those interviews right behind the lines. And they were very useful. The psychiatrists depended on them. And as the war started to wind down, and as people began to be mustered out, there was a hue and cry from many of the people who had served in those kinds of posts. Can this be a career we can go into and get more training for in civilian life when we come out of the military? And the government decided it was going to create two professions. It was going to create a profession known as clinical psychology. And clinical psychologists would work with the people who had been wounded psychologically and were carrying psychological deficits, and it would create a profession known as counseling psychology. And the counseling psychologists would work with people who were having problems of adjustment as they were returning to the home front. And obviously, the biggest consumer of those professions in the early days towards after the war would be the VA would hire them, and the U.S. Public Health Service would hire them. So it was going to pay for the training of people it thought the government needed to hire and to employ. It asked the American Psychological Association, as the planning was unfolding in 1944, who should do this training? Should the psychiatric profession train the clinical psychologist? Should social work train the counseling psychologists? Where should the training take place? And of course, if you ask anybody who should do the training, the people you ask will immediately say, we should do the training. So the American Psychological Association answered that the nation's departments of psychology would be happy to do the new training for the new professions. If there's anything that departments of psychology like, it's getting money from grant agencies or from the government. Big tons of money pouring into the departments. They can do all kinds of things with that money that they hunger to do. So suddenly the departments in psychology were going to take on responsibilities they had never taken on before. Training people to work with this, the quote, psychiatrically ill, and training people to counsel people with problems of adjustment. They had been research academic institutions. They had trained people to find a niche of research in psychology, to go start a program of research, to write papers and books about it, and to teach courses in the traditional courses in psychology. The people who came off the campus and were doing applied work and getting paid to do testing, for instance, were considered traitors. They were considered, they had given up the sacred mission of psychology. They had stopped doing research. They had stopped doing teaching. What the hell were they doing out there? Money grubbers, doing some hoodoo for the public and getting paid for doing that. There was great skepticism on the part of the leadership of departments of psychology, the movements out into the community. So as I made my way through undergraduate school and got ready to apply for graduate school, I again asked Jim Butenthal, if I'm going to become a psychologist, where shall I apply? Shall I apply for programs in counseling psychology, or shall I apply to programs in psychology? Which university to apply to? He said the government has decided that the problem with psychiatric clients is much more chronic. They're pouring more money into departments of clinicals, into training in clinical psychology, because they think they're going to be more people, need more people doing that in the years ahead. And they're beginning to cut the budgets back on counseling psychology programs. And you'd probably have a greater chance of getting admitted to graduate school if you apply in clinical psychology. And he said, and this was true at the time, it depends on what kind of training you want. It seems like there are 3 different kinds of clinical psychologists being trained, and departments vary along this dimension. Many of the departments are training clinical psychologists who want to use the principles of behavioral psychology to help change and support people. Classical conditioning techniques, instrumental conditioning techniques. You will learn a lot about Pavlov and about Skinner and the whole group of people who declare that they are behaviorists. That is the orientation of the department, and that's what you're going to be asked to learn. There is another countervailing movement. There are a large number of departments across the country that are teaching psychoanalysis. Freudian analysts have left Germany in large numbers. A lot of them have found teaching posts in departments of psychology, and they teach fairly traditional and orthodox psychoanalysis as the way they think you should be trained and the things you need to know in order to get ready for your careers. And then there's only 2 places, only one place now, there used to be 2, the University of Chicago and Ohio State, that is training what's coming to be called client-centered psychotherapy. Carl Rogers is having an influence, a beginning influence in how we think about the profession and how people should be treated. And he started teaching at the University of Chicago, but he's now at Ohio State. And you will learn client-centered therapy if you go there. And it's an entirely different way of thinking about people, their challenges, and what the worker needs to do to meet with them and bond with them and create a good environment for them to change. I said, I've learned about behaviorism here. Many of the professors in this department are behaviorists. I don't like it. It's like conditioning dogs. It doesn't feel human or humane to me. I know a little bit about psychoanalysis. At least the client is taken seriously, and the client gets a chance to talk a lot about what the client is struggling with. I do know, I've read Roger's book, first book, Client-Centered Psychotherapy. I find it quite meaningful. It doesn't seem to have as many theories or as much structure as psychoanalysis does. So I will apply. I'll apply to Ohio State, but I'm going to apply to a bunch of psychoanalytic programs too. And I'll see who wants me, and I'll see who seems to be making me the best financial aid offer, because I'm going to need financial aid if I go. I'm going to be an out-of-state student wherever I am, and the private institutions are very pricey. And if you're not a resident of the state where you go to the state college, state university, there's out-of-state tuition, and that's almost as pricey as going to a private university. So off I went. I took the graduate record exam. I took the Miller's analogy test. I turned my transcripts over. And I applied to a bunch of schools. Well, it was the University of Michigan that made me the best offer. And by the way, you must know that admission to graduate school was not an easy thing. In the year I applied to graduate school, there were 6,000 applications for admissions to one or another of those programs. The University of Michigan itself had 550 applications, and it admitted 12 students. That was its admissions quota for that year. So I felt very privileged, and they made me a wonderful offer. It was better felt to me than football players get. I would have to pay no tuition whatsoever. They would give me a living stipend every month to live on, so I could pay rent and eat. And I was to have both a research assistantship and a teaching assistantship. That's what I had to do to merit my scholarships and my support funds. And I would pick and line up with somebody whose teaching I liked, and I would be their assistant, helping them grade their papers and maybe teaching an occasional lecture. And I would join somebody's research lab and maybe analyze some data or run some rats or God knows what I'd be doing. But that felt fine to me. There were a limited number of hours a week I had to do either of those things. So there I went off to the University of Michigan. And I'm going to stop in a few minutes, but there's certainly one more thing I have to talk about. I was badly wounded still. I was able to function exceptionally well in an academic setting. I had friends. I was not socially shy or constrained, but I was very frail. One of the things that troubled me as I got ready to go to graduate school was I was going to be all alone in a city I had never been to. I didn't know anybody there. I had no support system. I was moving away from friends and family. And I was very frightened about making that big jump into the unknown, strange place and having to adjust with no support. There was no Zoom back then. that might have helped. All the time I had been in high school and college, I had had a woman by my side. When in high school, I met the woman of what I thought was going to be the woman of my life. I was 16 and she was 15, and I immediately bonded with her. And she was the only one I spent time with all during high school. And I was daydreaming about marrying her. And she was problematic. She had her own wounds. She could get very histrionic and cry bitterly in fear. She had hypochondriasis. I had to rush her to the emergency hospital periodically because she was convinced she was coming down with cancer when she was not. I knew she was a troubled person, but also she was very averse to having sex. We could masturbate each other, but I was not allowed to penetrate her. And that was very troublesome too. But I was convinced I was going to become a psychologist. I would learn how to be with her. I would learn how to heal her. I would learn how to make her better. But at some point in my sophomore year in high school, there was too much drama, too much unpleasantness, too much disappointment, and I separated from her. And she was so attached to me and so crazily dependent on me. When I told her this was going to be the last time we were going to meet, I needed to get on with my life, and I needed a different companion. She threw herself on the floor and wrapped her arms around my legs. I had trouble extricating myself so I could get out of her home and go back to my own place. She was crying, "You can't leave me. I'll commit suicide if I leave." Her mother used to threaten her with suicide. So she was doing her mother's tactics to me. And I felt so guilty and so ashamed of what I was doing to her. At the same time, I was telling myself, I don't want as a wife somebody who behaves this way. I have to separate from her. I don't know if I can heal her. That's a crazy daydream. And I did separate. Well, the world was kind to me. And 6 months later, uh, I was I was still living at home then to save money for graduate school. I didn't know how much I would need. I looked over the back fence. I was going to go out and sun myself and do some summer school homework in the backyard. And there was a beautiful young woman sitting in my neighbor's backyard. I couldn't imagine who that was because they were a childless couple, but I said hello to her over the fence, and she introduced herself to me, and she told me that they were her aunt and uncle who lived there, and she was going to be living there for some time to come because she had been accepted at UCLA, and she was going to be starting UCLA in the fall. And I was overjoyed. She said, "I'm just trying to fill out my program. Do you have any, same thing, do you have any wisdom about the professors? I don't know which professors to take." So I started to meet with her regularly, and we fell in love with each other. And I was so happy. I thought, now I do have my wife. Now you have to remember, I was of age. In my age cohort, half the people I was going to college with had already married, and it was you were expected to get married in your early 20s, and if you weren't married by your middle 20s, you were thought to be a secret homosexual, a perennial bachelor, or a perennial spinster. There was some defect in you that was keeping you from being married because everybody got married. That was what you were supposed to do. Well, I wanted to get married because I was too lonely if I didn't have somebody by my side. That damn wound from my mother was always active in me. I needed affirmation. I needed validation. I needed to look in somebody's eyes and see a look of pleasure rather than a disinterest or of disdain. So I had found my love. But I will cut this story short because I'm almost out of time. Roberta came from the wealthiest Jewish family in Riverside, California. She was formidably bright. She had gone to early admission at the University of Chicago at age 16. They had let her leave high school and start college because she was so formidably bright. That's what the University of Chicago was known for in that year. You could get early, the youngest student at the University of Chicago was 12 years old, a genius at age 12. So, but she had missed her family. She didn't feel socially adept enough. She wanted to come home, and that's why she had come to live with her aunt and uncle, and had traded Chicago for UCLA. But I was so happy to be with her. I, however, was not good enough for her father. He had made multi-million dollars in the Inland Empire as a pharmacist. As the post-war boom was happening and population was spilling into that part of the country in great numbers, he had founded successfully 7 different pharmacies scattered all around Riverside County by this time. They were all making piles of money, and he had become a very wealthy man. He was president of the synagogue, very busy in philanthropy. And when he found out I was going to be a psychologist, he told his daughter she better not get too serious with me. I was never going to be a proper husband. He would never approve of a marriage. She had to marry a lawyer, a physician, or maybe a banker or accountant. But he wasn't so sure about the latter. It depended on what they did and how much affluence it looked like they were headed for, and whether they had inheritances waiting for them. But he was going to, her husband had to pass muster, and she didn't have the courage to defy him. She would cry and say, I can't stand this. This is ripping my heart out, but I'm dependent on him. He supports me and pays my tuition. You can't make college education happening for me, and you're going to be leaving soon. I begged her to come away with me. I begged her to elope and get married as soon as she turned 18. I begged her to keep the secret, and she would come off to graduate school with me. But she couldn't withstand his constant barraging, and he needed evidence that she was starting dating other people, or he wouldn't leave her alone. So I lost her, and I was all alone heading for graduate school. So I did the most idiotic thing possible. I called my former girlfriend, Diane, and I said to her, I've been accepted to graduate school. I'm going in September. Are you still single? And she said she was. And I apologized to her for having left her and given up on her. And I said, you can come back in my life and let's get married. I'm ready now. I'm sorry I wasn't ready to marry you before. And then I asked you to leave. And back she came, and I did marry her. And that was one of the worst decisions of my life. And on that note, I will end. And I want to thank the people who are still present with me today. My two quasi-producers, Aaron Bergen and Scott Harris, of course, are here. And Sarit Ophir has given up her afternoon time to join me. And Sherry Nader was in residence for part of the time I was talking. So I want to honor them. And I'll throw this open to any comments or any questions anybody wants to make.
I've got one. Arthur, aside from not marrying that first wife, if you could go back to young Arthur and give him some advice, what would you tell him?
Oh, you mean about spending my adolescence differently?
Yeah, anything that would that you think might have helped him out or given him some sort of leg up on life.
I wish I could have calmed him more. I would have told him, you don't have to battle so hard to be significant. You don't have to try and please everybody all the time. You don't have to show off how smart you are. Ease it back. You are fine. I wish you believed that you were fine. I wish you believed that you were wise. I wish you believed you had the attributes necessary to build a good future. I'm so sorry that you're still trying to heal the wound your mother inflicted on you. It isn't really necessary. I wish you could stop and discover that it's not necessary.
And also, I think Jim Butenthal, I think he poached you for psychology. I think he was destined to be a nuclear physicist, and he just put his finger on the scales. He saw a bright guy, and he's like, I'm going to get him on our team.
You don't think I should have rebelled and told him, I'm not interested in that. Why are you trying to convince me to become like you?
Exactly.
Oh, but he was yet the next symbolic father. Not only did I have a mother who didn't think I was born, but I had a father who died when I was 12. So I was looking for father replacements too all the time. It was particularly significant if I could get a father to care for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to please him. I was going to take his advice.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I have a question. What's it like sitting in my audience listening to this?
It feels like I'm reading a book, and it's like the beginning last week, and now it's a continuation. So I have a chapter every week. It's amazing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, well, here I am needing to be reaffirmed. Is the book at least interesting?
Otherwise, I wouldn't be here today.
Oh, thank you.
I would drop it last week.
The history is important in terms of understanding kind of like how you think and what you've done in your life.
Yes, it is. I believe that's true too.
So it's vital.
I forgot who it is that wrote this as a title of a book in our field, that the therapist is the therapy. So the forces that molded me, the life experiences that were significant for me, certainly influence how I think about the work I do, what I say to clients, what memories occur to me when I'm sitting in the consulting room, memories of which, some of which can be terribly helpful. So yes, I'm glad to make myself known as well as I can shed light on what my profession consists of in these offerings.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the advantage of the whole situation is that you are so available personally, and that almost in like you were talking about Rogers earlier, it's like it's a little bit of a case study.
Yes.
Yeah.
But your life history provides you with tremendous compassion and empathy.
Yeah. my wife sometimes says to me, "You have too much empathy. You give away too much of yourself, and you don't take enough care of yourself." So she keeps trying to act as a corrective. Maybe there is such a thing as an excess of empathy. Of course there is. This is one of the things I teach. We're endowed with two competing motivational forces in us. One of them is altruism and empathy, to be concerned about the other individuals who are part of the collectives we belong to, and egocentrism, to take care of the self, to want to advantage the self, to want to have adventures, to want to benefit the self, to want to not to have to think about other people for periods of time. And we alternate back and forth between those two. And some of us have one or another in excess, and that causes us trouble.
Well, I think you found a good balance with Hermine then.
And this is not about her, so I will not gossip about what I have to balance in her.
Absolutely nothing. She's perfect.
All right. It's time to stop today.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, what time are we going to do this next week?
Same time, 4
Same
o'clock.
time, 4 o'clock.
Same time.
Why? I'm going to spank you with a wet noodle.
Yes, yes. I had a crisis call from a client, and it was right before the time that I was supposed to be on. So,
Oh, I'm really sorry. But it's nice to see you.
Mhm.
Bye.
yes.
Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Mhm.